Hello, everyone. I'm Bob. Today is Saturday, May 2nd, 2020. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today, we continue with Phase 7 of the 36th webinar in our series of webinars on the topic, Comparing and Contrasting the True Teachings of Jesus with the Traditional Tenets and Practices of Organized Institutional Christianity. This is Topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is the author and is also the chairman of the committee. I'm turning this webinar over to Neil now. Neil.
Thank you, Bob. We begin the month of May, or at least the second day of the month of May, with another of our series of webinars on the topic that you indicated. We are continuing to discuss the comparison and contrast of the true teachings of Jesus with the tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. In particular, we will be discussing portions of my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, that I wrote in the middle of 2019. Now, for viewers who may not have been following our series, I would recommend that you download the applicable documents so that you will be able to follow our discussion closely and completely in understanding what we're talking about. The context is my long discussion document, Revelation Revealed, that dates from the middle of 2016, but today we will be considering elements of a supplement to it that I wrote in the middle of 2019, namely my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. Now, in order to obtain access to these documents, if you do not already have them, you could download them from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. The citation is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. Global Endeavor in this citation is treated as a single word without any space or punctuation in the middle. The links to the document Revelation Revealed and the document Living the Real Religion of Jesus are about 2/3 of the way down the homepage. Now, we will move toward the substantive part of our discussion, which indeed pertains to page 12 of my document, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. We have just finished considering 3 paragraphs from the instructions that Emmanuel gave to Christ Michael before he, Michael, left Salvington in order to come to Urantia as the bestowal son on our planet, and for that matter, the bestowal son for the entire local universe. The first topic specifically that we will discuss pertains to formal question H on page 12 of the document. This question pertains to marriage and divorce. And as a preliminary set of ideas pertaining to this question, I would like to turn to a segment of paper 83 of the Urantia book that pertains to marriage and divorce. And in particular, this section is called The Idealization of Marriage. It is section 8 in paper 83, written by the Chief of Seraphim. And the first 4 paragraphs in this section are immediately relevant to the question that we will consider. So I would ask for volunteers to read these first 2 paragraphs. Bob, may I call on you to read the first 2, and then Stephen, could you pick up where Bob leaves off and read the 3rd and 4th paragraphs? Okay, Bob, please.
Sure, Neil. This is section 8, the idealization of marriage. Marriage, which culminates in the home, is indeed man's most exalted institution, but it is essentially human. It should never have been called a sacrament. The Sethite priest made marriage a religious ritual, but for thousands of years after Eden, mating continued as a purely social and civil institution. The likening of human associations to divine associations is most unfortunate. The union of husband and wife in marriage home, in the marriage-home relationship, is a material function of the mortals of the evolutionary worlds. True, indeed, much spiritual progress may accrue consequent upon the sincere human efforts of husband and wife to progress, but this does not mean that marriage is necessarily sacred. Spiritual progress is a tenet upon sincere application to other avenues of human endeavor.
Thank you. Stephen?
Neither can marriage be truly compared to the relation of the adjuster to man, nor to the fraternity of Christ Michael and his human brethren. At scarcely any point are such relationships comparable to the association of husband and wife. And it is most unfortunate that the human misconception of these relationships has produced so much confusion as to the status of marriage. It is also unfortunate that certain groups of mortals have conceived marriage as being consummated by divine action. Such beliefs lead directly to the concept of the indissolubility of the marital state, regardless of the circumstances or wishes of the contracting parties. But the very fact of marriage dissolution itself indicates that deity is not a conjoining party to such unions. If God has once joined any two things or persons together, they will remain thus joined until such a time as the divine will decrees their separation. But regarding marriage, which is a human institution, who shall presume to sit in judgment to say which marriages are unions that might be approved by the universe supervisors, in contrast with those which are purely human in nature and origin?
Thank you. I think this paragraph, I'm sorry, this series of paragraphs is a useful background point to the question that we are going to consider, whereby the teachings laid down in the New Testament are contrary to these ideas that the Chief of Seraphim has shared. So we now go to formal question H, and I will read the question. The Midwear Commission states, quote, Jesus repeatedly refused to lay down laws regarding marriage and divorce, but many of Jesus's early followers had strong opinions on divorce and did not hesitate to attribute them to him. Quotation by the Midwear Commission in section 8 of paper 140, paragraph 14 in that section. Continuing the question. For example, quote, what therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder, unquote, is taken from two verses of the gospel, one from the Gospel of Matthew, verse 6 in chapter 19, and one from verse 9 in chapter 10 of the Gospel according to Mark. In both cases, the translation called the Revised Standard Version. Returning to the question, if Jesus really had pronounced moral principles pertaining to marriage and divorce, would any such commandment of his have violated Emmanuel's instructions that in relation to the social order, he confine his efforts largely to spiritual regeneration and intellectual emancipation? Andre, would you be the first person to give your reactions to that question, and for that matter, to the overall circumstances?
Sure. I mean, I could be brief and say,
Yes.
yes. You know, when you give yes and no questions, it makes it much easier on us. So thank you very much, Neil. I'll confine my, no, there's not much need for elaboration, but what I love in what we just read out of the paper on marriage and family life is, number one, this idea that whatever God would join could not have been truly broken. Therefore, what can be broken, God cannot have joined. That is an important realization. Secondly, this idea, you know, Jesus did comment on marriage and divorce, but he made sure not to make them pronouncements. He did allude to the idea that in one place, and I'll come back to that later, where he said, but Moses would never have sanctioned, you know, such easy and lax rules on divorce. So he made commentary, but he didn't try to set down a rule which would have violated Emmanuel's instructions. So I hope you're satisfied with that elaboration on your yes and no question.
I thank you for that. I will indeed call for additional remarks, but before I do that, I will turn to another panelist, in particular to Marvin, for his reactions and comments. Marvin, you're muted. You'll have to turn yourself on. I know that you'd like to turn the rest of us on, but anyway, you have to turn yourself on first.
Thanks, thanks, Neil. I'll leave that parenthetical comment unaddressed. I stand with my brother Andre. Yes, in response to your question.
All right. So in case you want something a little bit more meaty than the question that Andre answered summarily, I think appropriately, I will ask you to comment on the ethics of this situation, whereby his followers did not hesitate to infer his views by quoting him incorrectly. What was the morality or the ethics of that?
You'll pardon me if I sidestep for a moment the morality or ethics and talk to the pragmatics of the situation.
Okay. Sure.
I think Emmanuel enjoined Jesus in this fashion for a very pragmatic reason, and it relates to other statements he made. The hope, the desire was that Jesus' teaching and life and teachings would become the freely available, rich reservoir to draw from for many traditions and many cultures and societies. And so they didn't want to burden his teaching and his life with the trappings of particular social injunctions, do this, do that, even with moral and ethical implications, because it would prevent certain groups from accepting his broader teachings because of this, what is it? Anyways, it's, they would lose the larger life and teachings and in refusal of the smaller social injunction. And so it was very pragmatic, I think. In order for it to spread effectively, it needed to be free of these trappings that were culturally bound. The mistake that the apostles made in ignoring that wisdom led exactly to the problem with Christianity that our Urantia Revelation cites, which is Jesus' life and teachings became mainly a Western cultural phenomenon and was prevented from spreading. And they make the same comment about the Melchizedek missionaries making that same mistake and preventing the assimilation of Melchizedek's teachings in many instances. So it's a general pragmatic principle, I think.
You promised me that you would return to the moral and ethical question about the teachings of the apostles. So now will you go ahead and do that, please?
Can you be a little more specific with your question?
Well, it's implied by the quotation from the Urantia book, had strong opinions, his early followers, and did not hesitate to attribute them to him. So his followers attributed their opinions to Jesus. They enunciated them authoritatively and dogmatically, and these teachings became part of the New Testament. For 2,000 years, people have misinterpreted this statement as a statement of Jesus. What was the morality or ethics of them misrepresenting his teachings?
I think it was an error. It was in a species of error or evil, in not deliberate sin. I don't think they were that aware that they were deliberately. I don't think they were deliberately violating his request. I think they wanted to make the teachings more effective, and they slipped into a practice that was unwise and that went contrary to what Emmanuel counseled Jesus. So it was a species of error and therefore evil, rather than a deliberately and consciously chosen violation of Jesus' request. But that's just my sense of it.
I think you are auditioning as a defense attorney. I will turn to Stephen and talk about deliberate misrepresentation as a moral and ethical issue.
Yeah, the prosecution here.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Here we are.
Well, a couple things. First of all, you have to understand that Jesus obviously never got married and never was married. And that made a very strong statement to all the Jews and all the potential followers that would constitute Christianity. That in itself was making a strong statement. So I think that the disciples, the apostles, were under a lot of pressure to somehow balance the strong social statement that Jesus made by never getting married. They had to balance that in some way, because that I think would have led, well, it did lead obviously to other kinds of social imbalances like monasticism and celibacy. And so if Jesus never got married, then why should I get married? And why should you get married? Why should anybody get married? And it's a more holy state not to be married than to be married, as Paul said. So they had a real problem on their hands. So talk about pragmatism. Well, they came up with a pragmatic solution. They had to balance the influence of what Jesus did in his life with something that they may have, intentionally or unintentionally interpreted something he said in a debate he had with the Pharisees, for instance. And that may have been something that they chose to interpret in a certain way in order to, create some kind of balance in the message that was being put out regarding his never being married. And not only that, they had a problem with the virgin birth, with their doctrine of the virgin birth. One of the first aspersions made onto Jesus and onto Christians was that Jesus was a bastard, an illegitimate son, because he had no father. And so the Christians were saying that Christ had no father, well, that he was a bastard. So not only did he never get married, he was a bastard. So that created a lot of potential problems for them. So I would look at it that way. I could also go into a thing about divine marriage, which was an age-old system of belief that comes for very good reasons, but I'll just avoid that whole idea of divine marriage among divine.
Thank you for these comments, which I think are useful as a cultural introduction to the situation. But I'm still intent on the question that I was trying to get an answer to, and I will turn to George. George, this verse in 2 of the 4 Gospels, what therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder, has been problematic for sincere Christian believers for hundreds of years, perhaps for 1,000 years or more, especially for those Christian believers who were convinced that the Bible, in particular the New Testament, is the infallible word of God, inerrant. So as a consequence of this verse from the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark, hundreds of millions of people who have had problematic marriages have found themselves torn spiritually. And I think it's fair to say that they were torn spiritually because of a misunderstanding and a falsehood. Now, please comment on the moral and ethical dimensions of this.
Well, yeah, certainly that has caused problems, which you just stated. The moral and ethical implications are not as easy to assess. First of all, the moral implications are that when you enter into marriage, you enter into a duty to God. In other words, you're making a commitment to God as well as to your spouse, which is, so that puts it on a different level than a simple human to human relationship, which is the error. So I look at it more as an error instead of, as I think it Stevens, or was it Marvin? Someone said it, I see it more as an error than as a sin. And I think I would see it the same way. In terms of the question that you originally asked, let's see, how did you phrase it? You said, is this you said if Jesus had really propounded moral principles pertaining to marriage and divorce, and then you continued, that's a somewhat different question than your focus on that statement in the Bible about what God has put together or joined, let no man put asunder. In other words, you're comparing what has been interpreted as a legal binding statement with a moral principle, when they're not the same thing. Certainly, Jesus never made definite pronouncements about what we should and shouldn't do, what the ethics of marriage should and shouldn't be, at least not directly. But he did present an exalted ideal of marriage really in a kind of remarkable way. I remembered something from his visit to Philadelphia, and in there are a number of comments in section 5, paper 167, where Jesus, one in paragraph 3 says, though Jesus, excuse me, though Jesus refused to be drawn into a controversy with the Pharisees concerning divorce, he did proclaim a positive teaching of the highest ideals regarding marriage. He exalted marriage as the most ideal and highest of all human relationships. Likewise, he intimated strong disapproval of the lax and unfair divorce practices of the Jerusalem Jews. And in the next paragraph, while Jesus refused to make pronouncements dealing with marriage and divorce, he did most bitterly denounce those shameful floutings of the marriage relationship of the Pharisees and pointed out their injustice to women and children. And then in the next paragraph, this is according to the Midway Commission, a quote of what Jesus said, rephrased in modern terms. Marriage is honorable and is to be desired by all men. The fact that the Son of Man pursues his earth mission alone is in no way a reflection on the desirability of marriage. That I should so work is the Father's will, but this same Father has directed the creation of male and female, and it is the divine will that men and women should find their highest service and consequent joy in the establishment of homes for the reception and training of children, in the creation of whom these parents become co-partners with the makers of heaven and earth. And for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and they two shall become as one. That last sentence is a directly parallels the section in Genesis describing God's creation of Adam and Eve, where it says, therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So all of this, I take your point about the moral and ethical issues, and I think I largely agree with them. But the other side of the coin, so to speak, is this high value that Jesus puts on the human relationship of marriage. And I don't think it's surprising, since marriage is the basis of family, which is the basis of civilization. So I think this goes back to, I think we're going to cover this later on, but this goes back to his certain privileges to deal with matters that don't directly involve personal religious experience. And I think he did this. He made these statements, made this rather definite statement about the ideals of marriage, simply because there's no Adam and Eve on the planet to serve as a paradigm for marriage for the world. So I think that's a justifiable reason for him exerting this privilege to step outside what might be the limits, the apparent limits of his bestowal commission.
Thank you, George. You've made a number of comments that are very incisive, worthwhile, and important. My question was not in any sense a criticism of marriage. It was a question pertaining to, first, the instructions that Emmanuel gave him, and that was the genesis of the question in the first place. But it also pertains to a needlessly explicit commandment that was ascribed to him. Even though he indeed praised the status of marriage, he did not make the commandment in the way that the authors of the New Testament stated. And that commandment at least has been interpreted to give hundreds of millions of sincere human beings who, for one reason or another, were not happy in their marriage, a serious spiritual problem because they thought that this statement was the word of God infallibly. Bob, you have now the role again of a cleanup hitter, and therefore an opportunity to make any comments that you think are appropriate.
Thanks, Neil. This is an area that is quite rich in studying about the progressive growth and society, moving society forward, being that, marriage and procreation with it is, part and parcel of the fact that there's 7 billion people on this planet right now. One thing that's interesting is every time that I read a paragraph, we weren't prepared for those 4 paragraphs, and so we basically read them. Andre brought out an interesting part there about what God puts together. It won't be broken out unless God decides to do that. The second sentence in the first paragraph was the one that really interests me, and I'll read that and then kind of comment back as to what I was going to talk about here. The Sethite priest made marriage a religious ritual, but for thousands of years after Eden, mating continued as a purely social and civil institution. Almost shows me that there's a cognitive dissonance that had been built into society. Now, obviously, because of the Adam and Eve problem, the unfortunate breakdown of society, and the fact that progressive growth and development of society broke down. The fact that the Sethite priest made them as a religious ritual makes me think that that had a particular interesting role with those advanced societies, who then connected into into this connection of both social and civil, as well as religious, and conflated all 3 of those things all together. So that was the first thought I had after reading that. I do want to mention that what George brought up was when Jesus was in Philadelphia. That's exactly the area that I focused on, and I made a note to myself to confer paper 167, section 5, 2 through 8, and George read a couple of those parts here that are very interesting. This was the time when Jesus got the word from the messenger that the Lazarus is sleeping, but Jesus said not to the death. Before he left, he spent some time talking about with the apostles, exactly what George had gone through. He talked very positively about marriage, And there's a couple of other things that I wanted to bring out about that, because he stayed around at the very end because the apostles asked him a bunch of questions about all this. One sentence that George didn't read that I think I will read here in paragraph 4, Jesus never sanctioned any divorce practice which gave man any advantage over woman. The master countenanced only those teachings which accorded women equality with men. What I think this is really a good example of the true teachings of Jesus versus the institutional, organizational dogma of the follow-on, after the resurrection. I think that to try and put this in perspective, again, Jesus teaches only the positive side of things, but in fact, he did not pull asunder, if I can use that term, any of the laws that were currently in place. What I see Jesus doing here is he's not tearing down the evolutionary religion, but he's raising the ideals. He's trying to raise the basic morality so that the ethical part of this can be then formulated by the humans. So right at the very end of this, I mentioned that the apostles tried to stick around and ask him questions because they were really not quite understanding all of this. And at the very end, it says, after he talked to the apostles, and he says, marriage is honorable and is to be desired by all men. The fact that the Son of Man pursues his earth mission alone is in no way a reflection on the desirability of marriage. He's saying that I'm going about my Father's will. But all the apostles that were there were having a difficult time with this because of the way that they were brought up in the mores and in the basic laws of the Jewish religion. So he says, and in this way, Jesus relieved the minds of the apostles of many worries about marriage and cleared up many misunderstandings regarding divorce. Now, the midwives didn't tell us exactly what that was, but he did spend some time with the apostles clearing that up to them. At the same time, he did much to exalt their ideals of social union and to augment their respect for women and children for the home. I think George brought that up also. And I think that what I'm seeing, what Jesus is doing is he's trying to place almost a hierarchy of social values that will then drive the morality of the individuals to be able to ethically work through their the variabilities of life. It seems to me that because the thought adjuster shows up with the first moral choice, and it's approximately at the age of 5.5 as of 1934, that morality, which is it's built, it's a super animal, but it's a true human acquirement, has to come from the mores, which is why the home is so important, because that's where the child learns what's right or wrong based upon the mores of the society. When that moral decision, it's not an ethical decision that makes the thought adjuster come or has the thought adjuster come. It's a moral decision. And that moral decision is based upon the mores. I thought about the whole causality element of what we're dealing with here. And that's why I felt it was such a rich area for discussion about morals, ethics, and mores. Not to get terribly deep into that, but again, I think that might have been why Jesus stuck around so long, because it is a very important social consideration to be able to understand that that there's a higher morality to be able to understand what the ethical positions should be for an individual to think about marriage. Back over to you, Neil.
Thank you. I think it is important at this point for me to try to summarize the different strands of the answers. And this is not a summary that will oblige anyone, but I do believe that we have talked about different aspects of this question. The fact that Jesus valued marriage, that Jesus enhanced the relative role of women in society, the fact that he valued the importance of raising children, the fact that he distinguished his own personal status as a special condition and not a model for others to follow, are all important elements. And he certainly did, as many of you have said, emphasize the dignity of marriage and the importance of family life. Now, the question comes from the fact that he did not make specific pronouncements about laws of marriage. He talked with the apostles at various times, enhancing their appreciation of the importance of the concept of marriage and the practice of marriage, but he did not put forward explicit requirements, explicit laws. Many of you have stated this. You've elaborated how he talked about these questions in a very general and idealistic way. So that is one set of observations, and I think those observations indeed are important. Now, this question that I asked pertains partly to the parallel instruction in Emmanuel's instructions to Michael that he refrained from establishing an organized church. And the text in the New Testament is part of the doctrines of the church that subsequently was established. And the people who wrote this verse deliberately ascribed intentions to him that he did not express. So now I will give my personal answer. I regard this practice of theirs, ascribing a statement to him that he did not make, as an institutional abuse. It has caused human problems for hundreds of millions of sincere believers for centuries. This statement about the inadmissibility of divorce, in fact, was the underlying cause for the Church of England under King Henry VIII to break off from the Roman Church. So the consequences of these teachings about divorce have afflicted many hundreds of millions of human beings in the 2,000 years that have elapsed. They do not pertain specifically to the importance of marriage. There is nothing in my question that undermines that or denies it. But from my perspective, and now again, I'm speaking personally, it represented an abuse of spiritual authority for the authors of the New Testament to ascribe teachings to Jesus that he did not teach. And these teachings in turn became part of a control by the organized institutional church over social life. All right, enough of my own personal views. I thank you for listening to my own personal take on this. Stephen, you'd like to add?
Yeah, just briefly, I'd just like to emphasize one sentence. What George introduced was very, very helpful from the paper 167. This would be section 5, paragraph 5. He constantly appealed to the written scriptures in his effort to improve their practices along these social lines. So while he might not have made specific social commandments and regulations, he came very close to doing so. And it is more than understandable that his followers would have remembered that and interpreted that in that kind of way, that he was definitely making recommendations along definite social lines. And for them to extend that into making more hard and fast pronouncements about Jesus said, what Jesus said is certainly understandable. And it's not like they took black and made it into white. They took one shade of gray and made it into another shade of gray. And it may have been an error, but it was certainly an understandable error and a pragmatic that they did for pragmatic reasons, understandable pragmatic reasons. And I don't describe any evil intent. Now, as to terms of consequences, yes, of course, any set of social rules among imperfect people and imperfect civilizations are going to have imperfect consequences. So if the rules on divorce had been more liberalized, not along the lines of what the church taught, there would have been other evil social consequences. People are evil, and men and women will take advantage of one another in whatever way they can, and to ascribe, a certain set of evil practices to what the disciples did about Jesus' teachings, I think it's just kind of naive. I mean, people will do bad things to one another regardless of whatever is written in their holy books. People will take advantage of it. So I just have a different point of view on that.
Thank you. We are not trying to reach unanimity here. As you very well know, our underlying principle is pluralism and diversity. This question inherently involves many different dimensions, and I am not denying at all. In fact, I am affirming the social and the inspirational importance of marriage and family life. Marvin, you would like to add?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. First of all, I want to apologize for not really getting the import of your question when you first asked me to respond. I thought you were talking about the morality or ethics of how the apostles dealt with Jesus' injunction, rather than the morality or ethics of marriage and whether it's an absolute divine injunction or etc., and how people have wrestled with the morals and ethics all down through the ages, which I think is a much broader question. And so just that one thought. Then two other points. One is, I think there are two ambiguities, not ambiguities. They're matters of nuance, really, that are wrapped up and threaded through a lot of our conversation. One, which is just intriguing to us as Urantia book readers, is the statements in the book about whether marriage is a divine institution are not absolute statements. They say, I can't give you the citation, but in essence, what they say is most marriages are not made in heaven. And that's still not a statement, even at the extreme degree that God ordains certain marriages. It's just that I think some unions have implications that go beyond value implications, service implications, who knows what kinds of implications, that go beyond simply the loyalties of this life, that may have implications for afterlife association and relationship. So yes, it's not made in heaven, but some marriages have enough quality that they have implications for the individuals and their ongoing relationship in the next life, even though family itself as an institution doesn't survive. So that's an interesting nuance. The other thing that we've been sort of moving in and out of, I think, in our conversation is a contrast in process in the realm of ethics and morality. And that is, do we deal with ethics and morality as in terms of definitive pronouncements that are made by institutions and religious leaders, which is of course what you're referring to, I think, Neil, which are rigid. They're not open to interpretation. They're definitive. Thou shalt not break up a marriage. It's made by God, etc. Or are ethical and moral decisions arrived at by virtue of some process of interpretive, live process of interaction between us and the spiritual agencies that function in us, primarily God's indwelling presence, the spirit of truth, angelic leading, etc. And I obviously think that the proper way to approach those choices is in the second manner, and that the establishment of a quote divine unquote injunction is a violation of that principle. And I think that's in keeping with what Jesus taught. He emphasized higher values that are embodied in the family institution and the value of that and the ideal of striving for those values. But I'm quite sure he was also saying this is open to individual interpretation in individual situations as a person searches for truth in their relationship with God. And for me, the very clear example of that is relationships where men or, well, any spouse is abusive with another spouse to the point of killing the spouse. And the justification that's given is a religious justification that, you know, the spouse can't leave because it's divinely mandated, and people have suffered and died in those circumstances. And the value of saying no, there are values, etc., but the integrity of my ethical and moral choice in my life, in my situation, is paramount, and I must work that out with God individually, creatively, and uniquely. And I think we'd all agree that that's really the process that is the more real, in a larger celestial sense, the more real ethical, moral process to engage in. Anyways.
Thank you, Marvin. I agree with the general principles that you've put forward, and I want to emphasize once again that the question that I was asking and the ways that I was pursuing it do not amount to criticizing marriage. In fact, I regard it as extremely important. The issue has to do with the relationship of group authority, specifically on the part of the institutional church, and how it affects individuals. Now, I must add, simply as an additional clarification, that the tenderness and the delicacy of these institutional questions have been greatly increased because of a policy step that the organized Christian church took at about the year 1000. Prior to that time, marriage among Christians had been a civil practice. The church did not have rules about conducting marriage, what the requirements were, and so on, until about the year 1000. The great theologian Augustine, who has many attributes, some positive, some negative, was actually married before he became bishop and all this. He was married under the Roman civil practice that allowed a second category of marriage for wealthy Roman males. He had a concubine in this practice. And in fact, he had a son by this practice. His son died in adolescence. But the reason I'm mentioning this story is because his practice of marriage before he became a theologian was at a time when he was a Christian, when the Christian church itself did not have institutions regarding marriage. Suddenly, at around the year 1000, the Christian church began legislating in these questions and legislating very explicitly and in detail. So the verse in the New Testament and two of the Gospels in turn acquired much greater specificity and force because the Christian church had begun to set itself up as an authority in regard to marriage. So this historical background perhaps adds to the sensitivity of the question that I was asking, and the fact that these statements ascribed to Jesus became a straitjacket for many sincere believers in the period subsequent to the fact that the church took authority over marriage. Now, again, I do not wish to leave any of you with the impression that I am undervaluing marriage. There are several papers in the Urantia book in which the Chief of Seraphim describes the importance of marriage and family life, going back to times in earlier circumstances in which most marriages were arranged by the parents. And many marriages were contracted for the sake of accumulating property. So we have an ongoing evolution in regard to marriage and family life, which is very, very important. What I am arguing for, what I am strenuously maintaining, is that these indeed are moral ideals that should be left to the individual and not a matter of dictation by an organized institution that we call the church. Does anyone else wish to contribute now? Well, gentlemen, thank you for your attention. Thank you for the deep reflections that you have shared. We will now move on to formal question I, which is the next question on page 12. I think there will be a greater degree of common view on this question and the answers pertaining to it. Question I, did Christ Michael, while incarnate in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth, carry out Emmanuel's recommendation that he leave behind him, quote, an enduring and improved system of positive religious ethics, unquote? How do you appraise the net results up to now? Is it reasonable to believe that Jesus's ethical teachings will eventually become the most widely accepted principles underlying the actions and aspirations of human beings who live on our planet Urantia? Why or why not? Well, on the first question, question H, I served it up to Andre first, so I will not subject him to that problem of being the first. In fact, I will turn to Stephen instead. Stephen, you have the first chance at question I.
Yeah, we broached this point or this question at some point in the past, and I just have a problem with the word system when it comes to ethics. I don't believe that Jesus left an ethical system in terms of, I mean, when I think of an ethical system, I think of something that's formally organized and can be rigorously applied to any given situation in a kind of almost like a cookbook fashion. I don't believe he left the system in that articulated sense of the word. I believe he left a spirit of ethics that's a living ethic, okay, much more than a systematic ethic. A systematic ethic to me is kind of a dead ethic. The thing that lives from Jesus' teachings is that when he spoke about these things, he spoke about that with parables, with stories, with words that are remembered in the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount, it's a lot of things, but it's not a system. And I think to apply that word to those teachings is really an abuse of the term. So I really do object to the word system or improved system. What his ethical teachings were spiritual in the highest sense, and therefore living and experiential in the highest sense. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. I understand and respect your point. I would simply respond that the phrase an enduring and improved system is part of the instructions from Emmanuel. It was not a statement on my part. I was simply quoting what Emmanuel said to Michael before he left Salvington. George, would you like to take up from there?
Yeah, I guess I have a little more liberal interpretation of the word system. I think I do see a system. I would suggest that Jesus did leave one. The gospel is one. Faith in the fatherhood of God and realization of the spiritual brotherhood of man is, as I see it, the foundation of an enduring and improved system of positive religious ethics. Faith establishes a personal spiritual relationship with the Father, and this relationship is experientially realized in the emergence of what they call cosmic morality, which is a term used 3 or 4 times in the book, and it indicates our relationship to the Supreme Being. So let's see, what is it? Paper 117. The temporal relation of man to the Supreme is the foundation for cosmic morality, the universal sensitivity to and acceptance of duty. This is a morality which transcends the temporal sense of relative right and wrong. It is a morality directly predicated on the self-conscious creature's appreciation of experiential obligation to experiential deity. End quote. So, to me, that indicates a system of positive system of religious ethics. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, George. Bob, you're next on my list of respondents. I would ask perhaps if you could address the timeline issues in the second half of the question about the future will eventually become the most widely accepted principles and so on. Why or why not? Looking at the evolution of humanity from this point forward, are Jesus's ethical teachings going to become widely accepted?
I think without a system, and I know that Steve made a very good rational discussion about the Union of Days shouldn't have used the word system. Steve, you're absolutely amazing. Sometimes you take issue with some of the revelation here, and I'm all for it. It makes me think about these terms in slightly different ways. So let me get back to the word system again before I finish my thought about your answer, about your timeline question, Neil. When we talked about system the last time, I was talking about it as as an input output. It's a closure where it's defined at and it's not fully closed, but it can take in. It's a dynamic, and it's sort of self-regulation, self-regulating, I should say. I think I used the home heating system as an example of that, where it develops you set a goal and it stays what they call homeostatic. It sits itself somewhere within a couple of degrees of what you set it, either turns off or comes on. The car cruise control is it's an automatic system. So I see a system as something that is dynamic. There's many other aspects of it, autopoietic, life, the life system. The system that the life carriers put in for this planet is just absolutely amazing. Even though viruses did retrogress and we're now facing all of that today, it was something that they really couldn't find. So this idea of if Jesus didn't, so here's my thought about this. Now, if Jesus didn't develop a system, and it says an enduring and improved system, so there must have been one that was in place before this all happened. And certainly, mores, morals, and ethics have an input-output system all on their own. And I think that there's a specific way that these operate, and I kind of sort of mentioned that in my last response, where I see that mores are the beginning of the developing morality of an individual. Obviously, someone could take issue with that, but without this system, I don't think that Jesus's ethical teachings would become widely accepted with the principles and underlying aspects that you've asked here. The system has to, something has to have a way to make this enduring. And if we look at the last 2,000 years with pulling in all of the mystery religions, all of the pagan thought that came into Christianity, that paragraph is in paper 195 where it says that, it took over the world, so to speak, or, I should say it took over the Occident, is indicative that there's some kind of a system that is dynamic, open-ended, and able to not only be homeostatic, but also be able to develop solutions to problems as they occur. So I think Now you've asked me for a timeline. I don't think I can put a time. We had talked about a timeline on one of the other questions, and I came out with an out of the box thought. But I think my point here is that eventually these will be widely accepted principles. And in fact, I think that the revelators, the midwayers, have already projected that as something that's going to happen. I mean, we've got the spirit of truth that it's been added. I see it as an enduring system. Over.
Thank you, Marvin. I would like now to try to focus on a specific element of the prediction in the question at the end will eventually become the most widely accepted principles. In effect, we're talking about ideas or goals or aspirations that Jesus voiced in ethical terms. And the question in terms of their becoming widely accepted, it has to do with whether or not these principles of his can get through the kind of filter or screen, you might say, that is attached to other religious traditions. Will his principles get through the traditions of theirs so as to be integrated with their own convictions on ethical levels and become part of an overarching arrangement that they accept in other faiths?
Was that a question?
I think so. The question has to do with whether his principles can be accepted into other faiths and be part of their overall understanding.
In attempting to, and I will try to respond to your question, but in sort of attempting to do that, I want to react to some extent to what Bob and Steve have shared.
Please,
very helpfully, so this issue of whether a system is an inert thing, sort of dead, or whether it's a living reality, and an interactive and a process reality. I rather think the second, in a real sense of a system. And so, I've shared this before, and I'll share it again real briefly. This statement, in aggregations, parts are added. In systems, parts are arranged. Systems are significant because of organization, positional values. In a good system, all factors are in cosmic position. In a bad system, something is either missing or displaced. It's in the wrong place. And they say more. And I was trying to think of some examples of high values or ethical imperatives that Jesus shared, or that the revelators share, and how do some of this discussion apply to actual pronouncements. And I thought of two that to me are helpful. One is where Jesus was asked about the highest imperatives in this business of the kingdom by one of the scribes and Pharisees, and he said, the highest systemic ethical imperatives are love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. There's a systemic arrangement of elements in those statements. There's us loving God with all of our heart, the emotion, mind, intellect, soul, and strength, the body, service, etc. There's a lot of systemic elements in that statement. In a second statement, if you look at the arrangement of the elements in it, Jesus said, forget not it is your personal faith in the exceedingly great and precious promises of God that ensures you're becoming partakers of the divine nature. So there's an arrangement of realities there that is quite systemic. Our faith, the exceedingly great, precious and precious promises of God, and a process of becoming partakers with divinity, of taking on the divine nature. There's a systemic arrangement, and those are all, they're systemic arrangements, but they're describing a process flow. I don't know how else to say it. It's nothing inert. It's a way of energy moving and things happening and relationships unfolding. And so in that sense, he was teaching something that had long-lasting systemic value about the relationships of elements to each other, but he was profoundly talking about living processes, not dead formulas. And so there's that point for me, and it really relates to the question I think you've just shared with me, Neil. How long will it take? My reaction is for each of us as individuals to take some of these systemic pronouncements that Jesus shared about ethical and moral unfolding relationships and process. It'll take through eternity and beyond. It's a never-ending process of these factors unfolding in us. I don't think it ever ends. And I think societally, that's the case as well. I mean, you could say it'll go on into light and life, but even then it will be continuing to unfold because these ethical arrangements that he described are eternal realities. They don't have an end point. They continue to evolve and emerge and develop endlessly, I think.
Okay, thank you. I will now turn to Andre. Last time you had the disadvantage of being first. This time you will have the questionable advantage of being last. Sometimes Bob has said that he likes that. I don't know whether you will like this one. Last time, Andre, you commented on the nature of responsibilities of a dispensational son. And you pointed out that Michael was coming to Urantia not because of his role as a creator son, but because of his function as a dispensational son to advance understanding on the planet, to bring humanity to a new starting point or to improve our starting point. And so I would say to you that this question of a dispensational role of Michael as the bestowal son in the form of Jesus of Nazareth is related to the latter part of the question on the page, eventually become the most widely accepted principles. He was upgrading or seeking to upgrade society and civilization from ethical and moral terms for the entire planet. And of course, we also know on behalf of his entire local universe. So if I now paraphrase the question at the end of that paragraph on the page, it has to do with whether you believe that he has already or will succeed in upgrading the ethical understanding, the moral principles that underlie civilization and society throughout our planet Urantia.
Well, another yes and no question. That's very nice. So I'll say yes. But no,
Andrew,
you
I'm
do
going to have to stop
elaboration, why
asking
or
you
why
yes and
not,
no questions.
at the end. And you make the good point about bringing up the dispensational aspect of this. In paper 52, section 2, paragraph 3, each dispensation, each mortal epoch receives an enlarged presentation of spiritual truth and religious ethics. I do not believe that the master was remiss in this effort, but I do take Stephen's point that it's hard to detect where he was very obvious in directly promulgating that. Did he promulgate his religious ethics largely through how he knew his spiritual teachings were going to be outworking? And I would say in the main, yes, that's how he would have done it. But he didn't confine himself solely to that. Furthermore, he's a Michael son, and he was working towards supreme sovereignty, and that immediately means he's a student of evolution. And we have to always understand Jesus as the consummate student and master of evolution. This is what he came here to do. So Is it any surprise then that he knew that in paper 195, in the introductory section, where it says in paragraph 3 that a new order of living was presented to the hungry hearts of these Western peoples. The situation meant immediate conflict between the older religious practice and the new Christianized version of Jesus' message to the world. Such a conflict must result in either decided victory for the new or for the old, or in some degree of compromise. History shows that the struggle ended in compromise. Christianity, here's the key. Christianity presumed to embrace too much for any one people to assimilate in 1 or 2 generations. It was not a simple spiritual appeal, such as Jesus had presented to the souls of men. It early struck a decided attitude on religious rituals, education, magic, medicine, art, literature, law, government, morals, sex regulation, polygamy, and in a limited degree, even slavery. And then they go on and they say, it affected, I could keep reading, but socialized in Christianity now boldly challenged the traditions of the human race embodied in the ethics, morality, and religions of Western civilization. So number one, he knew 2 things. He knew his teachings were going to affect ethics. He did know that. What he also knew was the way they would be outworking was that there would be tremendous compromise. Do you think this was a surprise to Jesus that largely his teachings would be distorted initially over the next 2,000 years? No. And so where does that leave us with regard to your question? He left enough in his teachings that those who would study it further, and let's not forget, we are part of the outworking of his teachings. This is certainly, this 5th epical revelation, while not ordered directly by Jesus, certainly was tacitly approved by Jesus, in that it must be approved by the 4 and 20 counselors, who Jesus himself appointed as, again, an evolutionary outworking of his acquirement of sovereignty and his being planetary prince on this planet. And so it brings us to, is there anything in his teachings that can be construed this way? Well, of course. If we go to paper 147, section 4, where the hapless Nathaniel asks the boneheaded question that we're all thankful for. Master, although you've taught us the positive version of the old rule of life, instructing us that we should do to others as we wish them to do to us, I do not fully discern how we can always abide by this injunction. Let me illustrate my contention by citing the example of a lustful man who thus wickedly looks upon his intended consort in sin. How can we teach that this evil intending man should do to others as he would they should do to him? Well, we longtime students of the Revelation, just love this for its humanity and for the outworking of it in the moral principles that Jesus then goes on to teach in the 6 moral levels. Now, this teaching has been, among your Urantia book readers, studied over and over and over again. It is recognized as a core teaching, and one that is, first of all, not very easy to understand, especially in the 3 latter moral levels. When we're talking about the level of the flesh, the level of the feelings, and the level of the mind, we largely get it. When we start talking the level of brotherly love, we still sort of get it. Then there's the moral level, which becomes a little bit more difficult in that it requires that objectivity, which frankly very few people have. and then the spiritual level, which transcends that by virtue of our relationship with God, as anyone in their particular development understands God. That to me would be an example of something left behind in the teachings, which clearly is going to have a positive outworking, not just on positive religious ethics, but on ethics overall.
Stephen, I see you motioning that you'd like to join again.
Yeah, just briefly, what Andre was just describing was a systematic approach, but it was not a systematic approach to ethics. It was a systematic approach to hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the study of how we understand things. And when Jesus was talking about different levels of how we use our understanding, different levels of understanding about things. That's one point. The other point is that I still maintain that Jesus was a lot more concerned about spiritual inspiration regarding ethical behavior than he was about systematic explication of ethical behavior. He was much more concerned that his message would be carried into the hearts of people than it would be systematically explainable to people. He was concerned with inspiration and motivation and not with systematics. That's still my contention.
Stephen, I think you have the last word in the discussion, but I will comment in effect that you have once again demonstrated your dedication to a systematic approach of evaluating semantics and logical principles, and I appreciate you for that, among many other attributes. Let's now go to, I'm sorry, Bob, you would like to join again?
Yeah, very, very brief. I wanted to support what Steve was saying there because I was thinking about this. In paper 170, section 3, paragraph 9, and I'll go to the middle of the paragraph there. It says, Jesus was never concerned with morals and ethics as such. He was wholly concerned with that inward and spiritual fellowship with God the Father, which so certainly and directly manifests itself as outward and loving service for man. So Stephen, thank you very much. I didn't bring that up before, but that's what you said pointed me back to that. So thanks.
Well, we've had 2 in a row of people congratulating each other. I suppose Marvin will now be the third.
Yeah, I want to go back even before Stephen and start with Andre, because I really appreciate what everyone has shared. But I had some thoughts in response to this passage Andre shared, and then Stephen's comments in relation to it. And I'll add my own. Here's another passage which I've thought about a lot, and really what it relates to is this idea that Christianity was not just a simple message of Jesus, which is what he really focused on, as Stephen highlighted, and what he hoped would spread throughout all cultures. Christianity was a fully developed ethical, moral, economic, and political system. It had all kinds of implications, and the paragraph Andre read beautifully unfolded that. And I want to share this paragraph, 149.2.1. Jesus understood the minds of men. He knew what was in the heart of man, and had his teachings been left as he presented them, the only commentary being the inspired interpretation afforded by his earth life, all nations and all religions of the world would speedily have embraced the gospel of the kingdom. The well-meant efforts of Jesus' early followers to restate his teachings so as to make them the more acceptable to certain nations, races, and religions only resulted in making such teachings the less acceptable to all other nations, races, and religions. And this is an amplification of some of what, that's a brilliant paragraph. It's such an interesting distinction. And it's very related, I think, to what Andre and Stephen were sharing. And I just want to make a point. The list that Andre shared of what Christianity set out to do and did is striking in that every element that is cited in that list, that long list, is repletely true of this fifth epical revelation. It strikes decided points of view on every one of those elements, right? So it also has this dilemma bound up in it of dual mission, of the uplift and transformation of civilization as a whole and its many institutions, as you've noted many times, Neil. And it also has the unaddressed imperative that still remains out there to be accomplished, that Jesus enjoined us, and that is to reach out, as Stephen says, with a simple message that he tried to share, that if it's left untrammeled by all these other endeavors, will spread easily and simply because of its universality throughout all religions and cultures, which is a high imperative. And I see too little of us in our movement, in our culture, being sufficiently attentive to these subtle distinctions in imperative and the different methodologies that flow from these different types of mission at different levels. And I think it's a risk. It's the same danger Christianity faced and failed to test of. I think we face with this revelation, and fail to distinguish between the simple mission of spiritual uplift, which should be pan-cultural, transcending all cultures, and all of the other endeavors that very worthily flow from this complex revelation.
Marvin, I understand the point that you've made. I think, though, that it would be helpful if I give a little bit of my own personal views in this regard. And Andre pointed out earlier that Jesus was functioning as a dispensational son, and he had certain missions. We've described the instructions, we've analyzed the instructions that Emmanuel gave him. Those instructions indeed called on him to concentrate on spiritual and religious uplift. And you have explained this. On the other hand, we have not been informed that the revelators who gave us the fifth epical revelation were likewise instructed to concentrate on spiritual and religious uplift. In fact, they did not. They concentrated on the full range of human life and experience. And in this regard, they returned to the general pattern for ethical revelation that applied to the first and second epical revelations, those of the original regime of the planetary prince and the original regime of Adam and Eve before they defaulted. So there is, in effect, a twofold goal, it seems to me. Now I'm speaking personally. We indeed need to find ways to reaffirm the spiritual uplift that Jesus sought to apply in his personal identity as Jesus of Nazareth, the bestowal of Michael of Nebadon. On the one hand. On the other hand, however, there is also a civilizational mission associated with the Urantia book as the continuation of the practice of epical revelation, having to do with the upgrade of the planet as a whole and all aspects of the planet as a whole. So now if I try to comment on your statement, it seems to me that we have to balance both sides of that equation, that there has to be attention properly paid to both halves of the equation.
Exactly. That's yeah,
we
I
have
agree.
to find some way to do that. And I recognize that finding some way to do that effectively is difficult. It is difficult to do either mission, but the practice that we have in front of us has to do with both missions, in effect, because of the nature of the fifth epical revelation as it is. So if I could, I will try once again to see if I can get you in particular as the stuckee to try to comment on whether Jesus's ethical teachings will filter into other traditions of religious life and spirituality in Urantia, not just the Christian tradition.
You're asking me?
I am indeed, yes, you're in front of me. At least you're on the screen in front of me.
Yeah. I'm hopeful. I think there's more discussion and more reasoned and careful discussion of these nuances going on now these days in the movement than there has been in times in the past. And that's encouraging to me, or there's a recognition that it's not either or. Which one do we focus on? But it really is an element of both and. but that it requires different approaches and methodologies and thinking process and leadership and service efforts in each of those realms, because they are specialized endeavors in a sense. And this is this conversation to me is wonderfully representative of the first set of imperatives. And there are other conversations and endeavors going on that are primarily focused on the second set of imperatives. And I think that's healthy. So I think we're likely to be successful. I'm sorry, I think I lost track. What was your question? Sorry.
Well, you're largely successful in walking around the contours. It's a little bit like doing a tour of a fire hydrant, and you've gone around almost the entire circumference. But my basic intent was to talk about the process of filtering certain ethical principles that Jesus propounded through the screen established by other religious traditions, and whether they will get through that filter.
I know what I was going to say in response was, it depends entirely, I think, on our level of success as followers of this revelation. I think out several generations, how successful will we be to get these two imperatives clearly envisioned and really address them? I think it's really up to us to to make a second effort with this tremendously upstep vision of Jesus' life and teachings, and reach out to these cultures and try to do it without the errors of the past. And if we do that, and if we are successful, I think it can very well happen. It's going on in the interfaith movement. It's going on numbers of other fronts. And I think it depends on whether we're successful with taking the import of this revelation and doing something effective evolutionarily and culturally in outreach. So it's up in the air still, I think.
Thank you. I will now succumb to the temptation of giving a partial answer to my own question. And I recognize that Andre has warned me against asking yes or no questions. And so I will answer yes, but will then state that yes is predicated on a proper understanding of the word eventually. Will eventually become. And I think, frankly, from a semantic and logical point of view, the word eventually gives us enough time for that. This revelation, I agree with many of you that it is addressed to the next 1,000 years. I think that in that period of 1,000 years, eventually probably will apply. On the other hand, I am very skeptical that this achievement will occur in our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes or even our grandchildren's lifetimes. I think it will take longer than that, but that the word eventually finally does correspond to the net results that will happen over a period of centuries. Well, gentlemen, I now propose to continue on to formal question J at the bottom of page 12. And this has to do with the relationship between group observance and individual religious relationships to God. Paragraph J, question J asks, in part, Emmanuel stated, quote, as a dispensational son, you are granted certain privileges pertaining to the advancement of the spiritual and religious status of the world peoples, unquote. In your view, were these remarks of Emmanuel's just permission for Jesus to emphasize the value and importance of personal, individual religion, even though he undoubtedly realized that these teachings were too advanced for the great majority of human beings living in his era? Or were these remarks, by implication, a strong recommendation of Emmanuel's that was closely associated with his responsibility to represent the universal Father? So unpacking that, it has to do with the relationship of group spirituality as compared with individual personal religion involving a human being's association with the Father. Stephen, you have
Yeah, I have a semantical question about the who does the his responsibility refer to? Emmanuel or Michael?
Well, which his is is it you're focusing on?
In the last sentence, that was closely associated with his responsibility to represent the universal Father. Whose responsibility are you referring to?
I think I would predominantly associate that with Michael's responsibility to represent the universal Father, but in fact, you have pointed to an ambiguity because it's also Emmanuel's responsibility to represent the universal Father. So you could take it either way. Maybe the best answer is both. Do you want to pursue it?
Well, I need to think about it a little bit.
All right. Well, while you're thinking, we will turn to George on the presumption that George can think more rapidly than you, but that may be a rash assumption.
That may be a rash assumption. I particularly like the way you phrased the question, meaning it's very, very convoluted the way you phrased it. And I'm still not sure I'm understand what you're asking, but I think in terms of not an easy question.
Could you rephrase the question, maybe?
I will
Yeah.
simplify the structure of the question. I realize that the sentence is a long one. In essence, it amounts to whether Emmanuel was merely giving Michael permission to emphasize individual personal religion, or was in effect instructing him to do that.
Well, the emphasis on personal religion was the whole purpose, as far as we're concerned, of the revelation. I mean, he had his own personal purposes involving achieving sovereignty in Lebanon, but our purpose as it was directed towards us was nothing but, so I don't understand the question. So I think I'll take the other half of the question and say that he was giving Jesus permission to go beyond that scope of work, namely the task of elevating personal religion on this planet. And thinking about it in those terms, these privileges really do, I think, really extend. Let me put it this way. He came here to do the Father's will, first and foremost, in fulfilling his desire to obtain sovereignty in Lebanon. And any instructions, counsel, advice, limitations contained in the bestowal commission would have to be superseded or supersedable, if that's a word, by the will of the Father. So Jesus was living the will of the Father. And well, shortly after his baptism, he fully recalled, in AD 26, he fully recalled the bestowal charge and its instructions administered by his elder brother Emmanuel ere he entered upon his Urantia incarnation. So he remembered everything Emmanuel said. And one of the things Emmanuel said was, I counsel you to function largely in the role of a teacher. And so for the next 3 years, Jesus followed this instruction, counsel, advice, and went around presenting himself as the Son of Man. In fact, it's really curious, well, maybe not curious, it's a very interesting fact that in the Bible, in the New Testament, the phrase Son of Man is only used by Jesus to refer to himself. It's never used by the apostles to refer to Jesus. And so that distinction is very interesting because Jesus spent the first 3 years amongst the apostles constantly talking about himself as the Son of Man, but they never thought of him that way. And in the summer of AD 29, Jesus finally decided it was the Father's will that he revealed the fact that he is also the Son of God. And so, what was it, August 10th, AD 29? Peter confesses that Jesus is the Son, the living Son of God, and Jesus acknowledges that, and that ended his role as a simple teacher. So technically, you could say he violated the limitations of his bestowal commission, but of course, that's not what happened. It's the will of the Father. Was the will of the Father that he do that. So, you know, it's instructive. It's been very instructive. I found the last 2 or 3 webinars very instructive, going through these bestowal instructions or the bestowal commission. It's been very helpful. But you know, this question really brings to mind that in the end, all of these limitations, advices, counsels, et cetera, can and have been superseded or were superseded when the will of the Father decided to. And, you know, Jesus made made 5 great decisions shortly after his baptism. And there are numerous instances where he intentionally performed miracles in apparent violation of the policies that he established. But of course, he didn't violate those decisions. They were just simply superseded by the will of the Father. That's my answer.
Okay, Stephen now seems to have had adequate time to reflect and to reiterate the general interpretation I offered before. It has to do with whether or not Emmanuel was explicitly instructing Jesus, instructing Michael to emphasize personal religion, the relationship of the individual believer to God, or whether he was simply allowing him to do that.
Yeah, I finally got that. So this question, which is a bit convoluted, is you're trying to ask, what did Manuel give just his permission for Michael to advance personal religion on Urantia? Was it just a permissional thing, or was it a strong recommendation? So that's kind of the sliding scale here between Emmanuel's permission versus Emmanuel's strong recommendation. That's the contrast you're trying to draw.
Yes.
And that's what I was having trouble trying to figure out. So I think I would agree with what George was saying, was that when you're talking to a creator son, I think the most you can do is just articulate a permission. In other words, articulate parameters, and what those parameters are rather than saying in very definitive terms, you should do this, you should not do that. So to answer the question directly, I would say that Manuel was putting out permissional advice. It was an advisory recommendation, not any kind of mandate or not any kind of even strong recommendation. It was in terms of a parameter that was suggested. So I would put it in that way. And of course, Jesus took that and did emphasize the value of personal, individualized religion, but he did it in ways that were sometimes beyond his mandate. As George mentioned, when it was pertinent or necessary, he did create situations, or he did participate in situations where he invoked powers that we call miraculous. So he was able to go beyond a certain set of behavioral norms that normally were present. So I would agree with George on that the will of the Father predominated because Emmanuel gave permission and not a mandate.
Thank you. Bob, I would like to turn to you next. Basically, once again, we have the question of emphasizing a personal relationship with God as opposed to an association with some organized group, and whether this was in effect a strong recommendation or simply permission for Jesus of Nazareth, the human incarnation of Christ Michael, to teach in that vein.
Thanks, Neil. I thought long and hard about this question as we kind of looked at it. It is a complex type question. I don't think either of these two are the two that I would actually assign to this, and it's because of two things. The sentence, and let me read it again so that we've all got this thing ground set. As a dispensational son, you are granted certain privileges pertaining to the advancement of the spiritual and religious status of the world peoples. So I kept focusing on world peoples and the spiritual and religious status of world peoples. It took a little while to really figure out whether this was a 1934 anachronism or really means something. And when we use the term peoples, it's a specific group. It could be ethnic, it could be cultural, but it's a specific group. If it said worlds, apostrophe S people or peoples, we'd be talking about the individuals. So I can see why you had your either on the group or the individual, either the personal religion or as the responsibilities of either Jesus or Emmanuel to the universal Father, representing to the Father. Let me just kind of mention another little aspect of all this, and because it's a dispensational son, there's two things that a dispensation is, at least in the revelation that we have, which is entirely different from a dispensational religion that we're somewhat familiar with in our conventional terms. So a dispensation, according to this revelation, is a period of time on an inhabited world of humans that begins when a celestial son of the local universe, creator son, or a paradise origin son, an Avana, descends onto the world for the purpose of revealing and educating the humans of spiritual or worldly effects. Now, it can be a Lunanadek son as the planetary prince, or it can be an Adam and Eve, that these dispensations, which are also referred to as planetary resurrections by the midwares, by the way, that's when all of the sleeping survivors from the period of that dispensation, which is a period of time, as I mentioned, then get adjudicated by that dispensational son. It turns out Jesus adjudicated them at the resurrection, which was a little different than when the planetary prince came. He did it as he came for the 500,000 years that all primitive human beings were there. So it's an adjudication, which is what a dispensational son does. That's just very basic. So taking those two things in mind here, I really couldn't come to grips with the either or part of your question. I think that he wasn't granting Jesus permission because he already had those that special. How did he call it? Let me get it right here. Certain privileges. I'm sorry. Granted, he's just telling them again that you've got certain privileges. So what were some of those certain privileges? Well, there's a couple of things that came to mind here, and I kind of searched, around to say, okay, well, did Jesus take some of this permission that he already had as a dispensational son? that we would probably find even with the Ivanhoes or the planetary prints. And came to mind that there is one paragraph that kind of leads me into this, and it's 157.6.6. And here's where he had to make a decision, and I think this is part of his permission as a dispensational son. Jesus had sincerely endeavored to lead his followers into the spiritual kingdom as a teacher, then as a teacher healer, but they would not have it so. He well knew that his earth mission could not possibly fulfill the messianic expectations of the Jewish people. The olden prophets had portrayed a Messiah which he could never be. He sought to establish the Father's kingdom as the Son of Man, but his followers would not go forward in the adventure. So he's stuck. You know, he's got to have some liberality of decision here. And you know, I go back to I don't think it's it's just part of the process. It's just part of the basic requirements or the open-ended type requirements that that the Paradise Father gives to dispensational sons. So here's the key for me. Jesus, seeing this, then elected to meet his believers partway, and in so doing prepared openly to assume the role of the bestowal Son of God. So he's got to make adjustments along the way. I don't think that that the part of he's really looking at everything. He's looking at establishing the paradigm for personal religion, and as well as he's thinking about this long term. The great paragraph Marvin read, that the basic systematic ethics that he could deliver at the very highest level were what he wanted to put in place to be able to reach even the lower status of spiritual lower status of those that may not have even known about him until the 20th century. And I give an example for that. It's one that where Doreen brought this up last week, and I found it in a journal actually. It was Lynn White. He was a historian, and he talks about when World War II was on. There was 1 million American soldiers that had gone through the island of Manus, and there were basically indigenous natives there that came in contact with with the Americans. This was just north of Australia and part of the New Guinea. I'm sorry, it's north of New Guinea. So here's what he says. He says, this was no accident. In 1953, Margaret Mead went back after 25 years of absence to visit the primitive but intelligent Manus living on the islands near northern New Guinea. She wanted to see what had happened to these few thousand people as a result of their experience during the Second World War, when more than 1 million American troops went through. And I'll just kind of paraphrase this a little bit here. So she spoke their language, and this is 25 years after this. First of all, to them, Americans seemed to be people who treated each other and the Manus with whom they came in contact like brothers, who in fact treated their neighbors like themselves in the fundamental sense that he was assumed to be the same kind of guy. Even American racial prejudices seemed to be relatively insignificant. So Margaret Mead, who actually knew the language, wrote as to what she got from one of the chiefs. And he says, the Americans believe in having work done by machines so that men can live to old age instead of dying worn out while they are still young. And another, from the Americans, we learn that human beings are irreplaceable and unexpendable, while all the material things are replaceable and so expendable. From the Americans, we learn that it is only human beings that are important. Well, that may not necessarily be the teachings of Jesus, but it's certainly a theme that rode through that would not have been something that would have happened in 1000 AD, let's say. So for that, I think that this particular question for me is um, Michael already had those permissions, and B, he had to make some basic adjustments with the with the mission that he was on, which was to ensure personal religion became part of a systemic uh, growth pattern for the progressive growth and development of society in the future. Back to you, Neil.
Thank you, Bob. I will now turn to Andre and assure him that I am not going to ask him a yes and no question. I have learned that it is unwise to do so because he
It's
may
too
get,
late.
it's too late.
It
Yes.
is a yes or no question.
Well,
And my
this
answer
time,
is no.
this time you have, in effect, certain privileges because you are the last of our panelists to comment on this question. And these privileges, in effect, allow you to draw on any of the earlier answers, or for that matter, any of my explanatory comments. Up to you, sir.
Well, I'd like to take a different angle on the question if I could. And that is, first of all, it stretches credulity for me to suppose that Michael did not already know all of what Emmanuel was telling him. Okay? This kind of instruction, publicly given, seemed to be more instructional in the sense of instructional for all the billions and trillions of beings that were paying attention, including ourselves historically, for understanding what the nature of the bestowal was going to be, and giving everybody else the ground rules, kind of like explaining, what happens in the Super Bowl to somebody who's never seen a Super Bowl before. Okay, here are the rules. Here's how this works. This is so that you understand the game. It stretches credulity for me to suppose that Michael did not already know this after his eons of prior instruction, all the way descending through Avona and into the super universe before ever he started and embarked on the adventure of creating the universe of Nebadon. So this then becomes, I think, instructional. It also, to me, becomes a little quizzical to suppose that these teachings were too advanced. The teaching of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man is too advanced, possibly for a backward world trying to reverse course and move in a different direction. But it's more in alignment for me to think that, again, Emmanuel is describing what he has the ability to do, and perhaps bringing that to the consciousness of all the beings as to why, because that certainly would bring that out. And so the question is, why are so many other things advancing so many other features of society and making deliberate efforts to do so out of line, and why is this in line? And to me, what comes to mind is that there is no spiritual or religious status advancement for anyone that is not a personal choice. That no matter what you're presenting to people, it still is of such a nature and so germane to the inner life to make the choice that it doesn't contravene evolution to suggest that, especially not the simple gospel. So my thought is that no, this wasn't just permission, and it certainly wasn't too advanced. And as far as any recommendation, it clearly was was a recommendation, but it was more rhetorical than anything else, in my view, that it really was intended for public consumption more than anything else, and for underscoring what Jesus already knew, or what Michael already knew, before he ever entered into this adventure.
Thank you, Andre. I would comment that your portrayal of Emmanuel's instructions as essentially for the record is interesting. It seems to be somewhat similar to Stephen's concerns about the word system. By implication, we are looking on these paragraphs as largely addressed to us, perhaps, or to onlookers in Michael's local universe. You have, in effect, stated that Michael already knew about these matters and had considerable freedom and privileges because of his role as a creator son, but also his role as a dispensational son. So I think that's an interesting idea. In terms of the word advanced, simply to explain what I intended when I said that the teachings were too advanced for the great majority of human beings, I had to do with the idea of group religion that pertained then and still largely pertains now. Whether people are willing to step away from the dictates of the group and the dogmas and traditions handed down by the group into their own personal relationship with God. And I agree that this should not be understood to be advanced, but most human beings living then had not reached that stage. And there is a question as to whether most human beings living now have reached that stage either. So
if I could make one comment on that.
Please go ahead.
Had his apostles really, I mean, they were so good at sticking to so many other rules. If they had stuck by that, at least that one rule, keep the gospel simple, stick to my teachings. You know, the revelators themselves feel that this would have been readily accepted by virtually every religion, every culture in the entire world. How long it would have taken to promulgate is an interesting question. Might it have taken this full 1,000 to 2,000 years to promulgate as opposed to the rapid promulgation of Christianity? I don't know, but perhaps it would have been more steady. And those are, I think, good questions to keep in mind. It'll be interesting to see what kinds of simulations they may run us through in presenting how they envisioned these teachings spreading. And you can bet that they have good ways of simulating evolutionary progress. It'll be very interesting for us to look at that later on.
Well, thank you, Andre. And indeed, as I implied when I started, you had the privilege of concluding the discussion. I think you have the privilege also of leaving us with very thoughtful reflections that we can ponder. At the moment, I am seized with the principle that we are now pretty close to the 2-hour mark for our webinar. We are customarily inclined to go a bit onward. I think I would like to introduce the question 5, in terms of the intent, and then understand that we will really wrestle with it. I'm sorry, question K, on the understanding that we will wrestle with it next week. And in the middle of the week, I circulated to you a background document, that is to say to all of you, in which I associated several quotations from the Urantia book with this question. And the background document begins by repeating the operational paragraph of Emmanuel's instructions, which I will proceed to read. This is paragraph 5 of those that we considered earlier. And it reads as follows: 5, as you may see fit, you are to identify yourself with existing religious and spiritual movements as they may be found on Urantia, but in every possible manner seek to avoid the formal establishment of an organized cult, a crystallized religion, or a segregated ethical grouping of mortal beings. Your life and teachings are to become the common heritage of all religions and all peoples. So this is the operational paragraph of the instructions. In effect, Andre has implied a belief that Michael really understood this in the first place, but the revelators have given this paragraph to us for our understanding. Now, the question in the document appears on page 13. It is question K. Marvin, do you have that question available? Would you be willing to read it for us? You're muted at the moment.
Sorry. Did Jesus follow Emmanuel's instructions that he, quote, in every possible manner seek to avoid the formal establishment of an organized cult, a crystallized religion, or a segregated ethical group of mortal beings, close quote. Did these instructions apply solely to Jesus himself or also to his followers? How do you interpret the fact that in subsequent generations, those who revered Jesus of Nazareth as the incarnate Son of God did establish an organized cult, a crystallized religion, and a segregated ethical grouping of mortal beings? Did these actions of theirs create permanent patterns that, in your opinion, will persist for all time? Or do there seem to be good reasons to hope and believe that the existing structure of organized institutional Christianity is temporary and will eventually yield to patterns of observance and belief that are far better attuned to the ideals that Emmanuel espoused and, by implication, the Father's plan?
Thank you for reading it. No, I will concede that this is a very complicated question. People have used the word convoluted in regard to some of my preceding questions. But I would say that this question involves quite a few different strands. And I think we will spend a substantial amount of time next week discussing it. I offer you that prospect. And at this point, I offer the opportunity for anyone who wishes to make concluding remarks, either in regard to the prospects for discussing this question next week or some other matter that he or she, that it has to be he, I'm sorry, that he wishes to talk about. And I see one hand already up, namely Marvin.
I rose quickly to the occasion because I'm going to have to actually exit right after I share some thoughts. A couple of observations. One is Jesus is clearly enjoined against establishing organized religious structures of this sort. Two, in other places, they say Jesus fully expected and indeed supported the efforts of the apostles to establish early procedures that would indeed lead to these kinds of developments of socialized religion. And they further state that those endeavors were laudable and inevitable, but that the great tragedy was that the institutional efforts that they pursued displaced the concept of the living religion of Jesus, the living organism, the higher reality of relationships that he was trying to hold out as the ideal. So they made that mistake, and it was a very serious error. And I think the challenge remains out ahead for us as followers of this revelation to see if we can correct that tendency, amend it, and engage in religious socialized efforts, which are inevitable and necessary if we're going to accomplish things other than our personal spiritual development. Can we engage in those endeavors in an organized fashion, establish institutions, even religious and spiritual usages that are much more alive and free and thrilling and point to higher realities that transcend those institutions? That's really the challenge. And I think it remains out ahead of us in relation to the work of this revelation.
Thank you, Marvin. In effect, you have I will recognize you in a moment, Stephen. You have reverted to a point that you partly voiced last week. It pertains to paragraph 13 in section 5 of paper 170. And I will read the first line and a half of that paragraph. It reads, Jesus foresaw that a social organization or church would follow the progress of the true spiritual kingdom. And I think you have explained that. But now, if you allow me, I will focus on a grammatical feature called an article. It says a social organization. It does not say the social organization or church. And the reason it doesn't is because the precise methods that actually were applied depended on decisions that his followers carried out. So we will discuss this next week. It does state in the view of the midwares that Jesus foresaw that a social organization would follow. It does not mean that Jesus foresaw the social organization that did emerge. And in fact, the social organization that did emerge was contrary to explicit instructions that he gave on two major points. Stephen, your turn.
I would just ask people to consider how the idea of a systematic ethic or systematic ethics is similar to the idea of an organized cult, a crystallized religion, and a segregated ethical grouping. I think all those things go hand in hand, that when you talk about ethical systems, you're already halfway there to organized cults, crystallized religion, and segregated ethical groupings. That's why I think Jesus was very, very careful not to introduce an ethical system. I'll leave it there.
Well, Stephen, you have once again illustrated your propensity to be systematic, and thank you. Does anyone else wish to take the floor briefly before we adjourn for the day, gentlemen? I see no further requests, and therefore I will thank you all for a very interesting meeting. I believe we will launch with an extremely interesting discussion of this formal question K when we reconvene next week. Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Good study. Thank you.